There are approximately 12 million migrants in the United States illegally. Why do they come? Are they caught up in a system that is fully apparent neither to them nor to us? Are U.S. citizens innocent bystanders? Are U.S. citizens caught up in the same system? Who benefits?
What was life like in Michoacán?
Muy bonita. Y nos la pasábamos siempre juntos. Toda la familia convivíamos. Pues ahora es diferente. Ahora
Why have millions of Latin Americans left their homes and families to make an illegal, expensive, dangerous, and sometimes deadly journey north? Americans are not innocent bystanders to the outpouring of illegal Latin American migrants. The cumulative effect of nearly 2 centuries of U.S. economic and foreign policies have contributed to the massive poverty and limited access to power of the people of Latin America.
For a number of reasons, Central America was not incorporated into the United States formally in the 1850s, say. And there's a fascinating history there because a lot of the issue of whether they would come in as slave-owning or non-slave-owning states. And so it was just clearly it wasn't going to happen. What's emerged instead is this much more complicated system through which this very, very powerful country to the north finds various ways to dominate these small Central American countries. If you look carefully at the cases, there's some pretty clear cases of U.S. domination and of just comprehensive violation of the sovereignty of these countries.
It's very important to keep in mind that today the U.S. Southwest was effectively stolen. First and foremost, it was stolen from the indigenous population, but it was also land that was effectively stolen from Mexico through the U.S.-Mexico War of 1846 to 1848, through which the United States effectively coerced Mexico into ceding what was then about 40% of Mexican territory. What the United States stole wasn't only the land, but all the rights that went with it.
This did not happen in a random, unintended way. There is a history of unequal relations between the United States and Latin America, and especially Mexico and Central America. On the one hand, there's a history of unequal economic relations that have put these Latin American countries in an economic rut that has led them to kind of an unequal and highly exploitative system. that leaves them forever dependent and subordinate to the more prosperous industrialized worlds. On the other hand, there are intentional policies by the United States, policies of intervention, policies of human rights violations that the U.S. has either directly participated in or supported, that has furthered this relationship of dominance and subordination.
Is the United States' increasingly rigid demarcation line fundamentally about promoting national security and the rule of law? Or is it fundamentally about cosmopolitan class privilege, no-holds-barred capitalism, and global apartheid?
Si estuviera en mis manos poder hacer cruzar a mi presidente por el desierto y sufrir uno de todos los atropellos que sufren los mexicanos cuando cruzan por ahí, creo que sería una buena idea.
In a few moments, I will sign the North American Free Trade Act into law. NAFTA will tear down trade barriers between our three nations. It will create the world's largest trade zone and create 200,000 jobs in this country.
In 1992, Canada, the United States, and Mexico entered into the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, signed by Canada's Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, America's President Bill Clinton, and Mexico's President Carlos Salinas. The purpose of the agreement was to facilitate the free flow of goods and capital across North American borders and open up markets to corporate producers. NAFTA was intended to create corporate wealth. In that, it has been successful. Changes to the system, or reforms as NAFTA's proponents called them, were made in three broad sectors: autos, energy, and agriculture. According to people who analyze NAFTA from the perspective of small traditional Mexican farmers, NAFTA has caused catastrophic suffering.
The problems that NAFTA has built on in Mexico and in Central America is one of extreme inequality. The levels of extreme inequality in Mexico and Central America have grown since the passage of NAFTA. And that extreme inequality is fundamental to the process of migration that we're looking at.
If you ask an economic migrant, if you had those opportunities in Mexico, would you come to the United States? The majority of them will say, absolutely not.
No hay para ganar un poco de dinero, pues no hay nada, nada más se siembra maíz y frijol, nada más eso se siembra pues para comer, para un poco para, o sea, pues si me gano un poco de maíz, pero se vende como 10, 15 kilos, pero para comprar un.
NAFTA lifted tariffs U.S. corporate producers have to pay to export corn, beans, and other crops to Mexico. This allowed them to undersell traditional farmers. In addition to NAFTA's lifting of tariffs, President Salinas repealed Article 27 of the Mexican Constitution, which had provided Mexican farmers with subsidies.
Uno de los problemas graves que han tenido los pequeños productores en México ha sido la privatización de la tierra, que tiene y está relacionada con NAFTA, con el Tratado de Libre Comercio. Cuando se privatiza la tierra a través del artículo 27, muchos de los agricultores, muchos de los ejidatarios perdieron sus derechos comunitarios.
Figures vary, but many analysts conclude that NAFTA has pushed at least 1.5 million peasants, many of whom were in the corn and bean sectors of the Mexican agricultural economy, over the edge financially. NAFTA forced these peasants off their lands and into migration.
Están exigiendo una tierra, unos ejidatarios, y no les daban. Uno de tan impotente se quemó, y después murió. Porque la protesta es seria, la protesta que nadie le hace caso. Entonces han llegado hasta el extremo de prenderse fuego para ver si le hacen caso.
The figure of peasants that have been displaced and indigenous peoples displaced because of the passing of NAFTA is a scandalously high number.
Bueno, es difícil saber cuánta gente ha sido desplazada del sector rural debido a las diferentes presiones. El Tratado de Libre Comercio, artículo 27, etcétera, pero se podría hablar de por lo menos 1 millón, 2 millones de personas.
The government understood at the time they signed it that they were signing away life rights for a large part of its rural population. It wasn't a surprise for the government leaders, and it wasn't a surprise for the peasantry.
What happened is that small farmers just got swept away.
The people who are hungriest, the poorest, have least access to jobs, who no longer can sell the small subsistence crops that they've been raising, are those that are forced to migrate. They have no other alternative.
The result is the same on both sides of the border, and that is that the elites benefit enormously. The folks who already have the educational opportunities and already have the wealth and already have the power, their wealth and power is enhanced dramatically, and the poor are the ones who are excluded, and the middle class is squeezed.
We can't have our cake and eat it too. We can't have a global political economy that helps drive people from their homelands, right? And then deny them the right to come to places where they're able to achieve the livelihoods that have been denied to them, in large part because of our actions, right? The only way we can do that is by being morally corrupt. And that's what the system of global apartheid is. It's morally corrupt.
They had hired me as a consultant for insulation down there. They hired me at $46 an hour plus all my expenses. And the people that I were training down there made $5 a day.
A los 14 años comencé a trabajar en maquiladora. Tuve que salirme de la escuela porque la economía empezó a bajar en México. Mi mamá empezó a tener problemas de salud. Entonces todos mis hermanos decidimos salir a trabajar para ayudar a mi papá y a mi mamá.
The conditions in the maquila areas was frightful. People living in cardboard houses. Literally, there were cardboard, the lucky ones would have a tin roof on cinder blocks. No electricity, no running water. There would be a sewer trench down the middle of the little streets. And I suppose they'd have a pump somewhere to pump their water. And I suspected it was probably contaminated water.
Cuando me junté con mi esposo en la maquiladora, pues casi al año salí embarazada de mi primer hija, que yo tenía que estar yendo frecuentemente al baño. En la maquiladora no se me daba permiso para ir al baño. Se me daba permiso solamente 2 veces.
I spoke with a gentleman that had lost an eye. I spoke with another woman that had lost several fingers. No compensation, no nothing. And what do? They fire them.
When you're purely doing everything based on profit, it doesn't matter where you live, it doesn't matter where your headquarters is, the desire to move overseas is almost too much for some people to handle. So I do have a difficult time with that.
And the government gave them incentives to move down there. I thought the American government was supposed to protect the American people and good paying jobs for Americans. Well, how is that right when you take and you tell a corporation, I'm going to give you a tax incentive to close your truck factory here in the United States, take jobs from American people because they don't want them anyways, and we're going to send them all to Mexico. To me, that doesn't make any sense.
I think that's the number one problem with the working people of America, is the outsourcing of jobs. And a lot of that goes back to NAFTA, CAFTA, and the China trade agreement.
Well, you know, that was a big North American free trade agreement, which was supposed to bring the Mexicans up to our standard of living. Instead of that, all the companies went offshore and used cheap slave labor to make the product and ship it back into the United States. And it caused a lot of our plants here to have to shut down because of that.
Democratic and Republican grassroots politicians and many labor union representatives also say that they are concerned that migrants and the employers who hire them are causing a rush to the bottom in terms of wages and working conditions.
It's my role as an elected official here to look out for the people that I represent and for the people of the state of Alabama. Wages have been suppressed. People have been displaced from their jobs because of illegal immigration.
Our people could use those jobs, but they're not there for them. Just like in Laurel, Mississippi, 600 plus folks stand in line for those jobs. So Americans will work. They're not fat and lazy.
Migrants, pro-migrant activists, and employers say migrants only take jobs domestic workers don't want.
Yeah, one of the things you hear is that immigrants aren't taking Americans' jobs because the Americans don't want the jobs that they're doing. That's not true. The Americans will do anything. They're taking jobs that Americans won't do at those wage rates or those benefits.
When we go and negotiate contracts, then it makes it hard for us to get a decent wage in there because they know, companies know that they can get the Hispanics to come in and work for the wages, like minimum wage. And the benefits and stuff that we try and get for our employees, then that makes it hard for us to get a decent package once we go in negotiation.
And the one that's making the money off of this and taking advantage of everybody is actually the people that's hiring them. They're still charging the same prices as if they had Americans out there working. They're paying the immigrants less. If I was addressing immigrants in general, we would try to organize them. If we could organize the immigrants, then we can compete with them. It goes back to then we're making the same wages, then we're getting the same benefits. And probably illegal immigrants too.
I know why you took my joy, you don't have very much yourself. I know why you took my home, to leverage a bit more wealth. I know why you took my medicine and gave it to the insurance man. But why did you take my job when I was doing the best that I can?
Free trade did to Mexico's small farmers on a massive scale what it did to Alabama's textile industry on a small scale. To the people of DeKalb County's town of Fort Payne, which once prided itself on being the sock capital of the world, free trade agreements with China, Canada, Caribbean countries, and Central America have been devastating. By 2005, 50 of Fort Payne's 150 sock manufacturing companies had closed or experienced employee layoffs.
We've been in business for 25 years when we'd had to close in 2005. And you'd have all these families working for you, and they became your family. It was like Thanksgiving and Christmas, you know, the mills would shut down and would have Thanksgiving parties and Christmas parties, and you knew who you were working with. And you got real close with those people. They've gone in other directions now to find work, and in the Chattanooga area and Scottsboro and different places, Huntsville.
In 2007, Montreal-based Gildan Activewear bought V.I. Pruitt & Son, Fort Payne's largest sock factory. Gildan, which had manufacturing facilities in Honduras, the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, and Haiti, was an opponent of import safeguards.
Do you have any feel for why a Montreal-owned company would want to come to Alabama and buy up the textile industry?
I can tell you why. Because labor in the South is cheap and there's no fear of unions.
Gildan is a multinational company that exists for one reason and one reason only, and that's profit. Basically, they're utilizing cheap labor with no benefits. They don't have to invest in machinery. They don't have to invest in land, buildings, any assets on U.S. soil. They move from country to country to country wherever the labor and the cost of doing business is the cheapest.
In 2008, 26 anti-illegal migrant bills were introduced into the Alabama state legislature. Alabama State Senator Scott Beeson sponsored many of the bills.
For illegal immigration, jobs and cost are big issues. They're easier to talk about. One of the issues for me is also kind of I see a gradual loss of what I consider a unified society. I see the gradual degradation of the English language. There are people who will say assimilation is going to happen. It's always happened before, assimilation will happen again. When the great migrations from Europe, where you had Italians coming in and people from countries, Russians were coming in, people from all over Europe were coming in, the numbers were nowhere near what they are now, but you never saw the push towards a bilingual state. I mean, we're talking about the state of Alabama having signs in every grocery store, signs at every pharmacy. You call any bank, you call the cable company, you call the phone company for service, and you have to choose between English and Spanish. I think that is a poor road to go down as a government. We should be a unified country. The goal should be that we're trying to assimilate people, and legal immigration in smaller numbers is something you can assimilate. I personally would like to see a fence all the way across for the money they spend talking and wasting on so many port projects in Washington. I think they could build that fence, and I would like to see the border sealed off, and then we can really deal with the problems.
This isn't about race. This isn't about anybody's ethnic background. It is about the law.
We are not against immigration. Our job is to stop terrorists and their weapons coming across our borders. While we're doing that, we're encountering illegal immigration. But there is a way to come into the country legally. And if you're not doing that, it is our duty to stop you and make you do things right.
For most Latin Americans, and for all poor people and all indigenous people who live on communally held lands, there is no line to get into in order to enter the United States legally. America has two basic systems by which a person may cross its borders legally. One system is for Canadians, Western Europeans, and some Eastern Europeans. They may enter with only a passport. Another system is for Latin Americans, Africans, and most Asians. They must have a visa to enter the U.S. legally.
Canada and Latin America are treated quite differently for immigration purposes.
Canadians aren't even considered aliens. They're considered foreign nationals, so they can freely come back and forth from Canada to the United States.
Porque así como nosotros, como guatemaltecos, a veces, que ustedes saben que en muchos países son diferentes, que hay países que son bien pobres, países que tienen hay muchas personas de bajos recursos, y en la cual que nosotros somos uno de las cuales que nosotros a veces no calificamos, porque no somos empresarios, no podemos viajar para acá.
People who don't own property and are very, very poor or live on communally held property, it is highly unlikely that they could show the strong enough ties to their home country in order to come. The number one reason that people are denied from coming to the United States is because of money.
Porque nos hacen un estudio socioeconómico y ven si uno no reúne los requisitos que tengamos dinero para venir para acá. En ese tiempo no tenía yo trabajo.
In the real estate?
Tampoco.
The question I get asked most is, why don't they come legally? They don't come legally because they can't.
There is an exception to America's legal barrier to poor people. It is the H-2A or H-2B guest worker visa. American employers, not foreign workers, request them. In Mobile, Alabama, seafood processors and shipbuilders testified before the Alabama legislature's joint Interim Patriotic Immigration Commission that they couldn't find domestic workers or could not afford to continuously employ workers idled during end-of-season lulls. They appealed for more guest worker visas.
Who owns Master Marine?
Master Marine is owned by a company in McLean, Virginia.
Is McLean the parent company?
Yes.
Or there's
Yeah.
another company on McLean? Nothing owns McLean.
Can we go off camera for a minute?
Bayou La Batterie is one of several areas in the United States where Sun Myung Moon and the Family Federation for World Peace and Unification, otherwise known as the Unification Church, have significant holdings. Master Marine is owned by the Unification Church. The Unification Church's finances are mysterious, but the London newspaper The Guardian estimates that Sun Myung Moon's personal worth is $990 million. The issue being raised was Mr. Dungan's representation of Master Marine's financial situation before the Joint Interim Patriotic Immigration Commission. Is Master Marine a financially limited mom-and-pop Alabama shipbuilder with a bona fide need for low-wage imported workers? Is Master Marine part of a global organization with substantial assets which can afford to employ domestic workers even if they must be idle during certain seasons of the year? Mr. Dungan declined to address the question.
We've hired American workers, family and non-family, and had trouble with them working, not showing up. These guys are working in the elements every day, in the heat, in the rain, and it's hard work. And every American that we've hired has either left before break at 9:30 or not come back.
We heard this from agriculture, we heard this from poultry, we heard this from large plants on the Gulf Coast. Oyster Group, they were very, very actively lobbying us to make sure the economic workforce side of this was met. Forestry was very, very adamant about a workforce need.
Last year we looked at the prevailing wages for tree planters in Alabama, and they tended to be, we looked at Selma, for example, that was $13 an hour. That's what the government sets as the prevailing wage rate that has to be paid to tree planters. We looked at that and we said, surely there is someone in Selma, Alabama who would be interested in working for $13 an hour plus overtime. That's a pretty decent wage.
Wilcox County, Perry County, Greene County, Lowndes County, all of those counties in the Black Belt, Selma, have unemployment rates 12, 14, 15%. It would be better to import those people. We've had a lot of supposition, a lot of hyperbole in taking advantage of that particular population, but we've seen very little activity in order to make it happen.
But the truth of it is that no one's looking in rural Alabama for these workers. They don't want workers from rural Alabama. They want the guest workers.
There's a holler down in yonder hills in the land of the free, in the hands that pick the fruit which fills the belly of the queen. She's sitting ripe, plump as a goose between a hill and a rock and a stream, and praying to the hangman's noose to lies and governor's clothes, nothing new. It's just another tyrant in the sheriff's shoes.
What we're saying is, if the government is going to set up this transnational system of recruitment, then it should hold responsible the people who are benefiting from this system, and that's employers.
A veces vender algún animalito, una vaca, un becerro, para sacar el dinero para poder viajar a los Estados Unidos o conseguir prestado para poder salir del país. Me gasté como 7,400 de gastos de camino, comidas, transporte y la visa, como 7,400 mexicanos.
Nos endrogamos para llegar allá a Monterrey. Ahí nos metieron en un hotel como de 0 estrellas. Como estábamos con otras 60 gentes en un solo cuarto, un solo baño para todos, sin agua al baño, por cierto. Nos iban a cobrar por llevarnos para allá como $1,500.
Anteriormente no, hasta mitad de temporada regresaban $160 a mitad de temporada y pues era muy poco para lo que se gastaba.
El problema con el sistema H2A es que los trabajadores van con una expectativa de mejorar sus condiciones, pero como van bajo un contrato, se ven forzados a trabajar con un solo patrón, aunque ese patrón no cumpla su lado del contrato, a no pagarles, por ejemplo, el salario mínimo, otros beneficios que les corresponden, o obligándolos a trabajar excesivamente, y estos trabajadores se les obliga diciéndoles que si no hacen este trabajo, les pueden cancelar la visa.
Bueno, la razón es de que pues aquí trabajamos la labor y pues no es suficiente para sostener la familia. Por eso pues decidimos ir a los Estados Unidos.
Mi papá se iba por necesidad, no por gusto. Y pues aquí no hay muchas oportunidades de trabajo, por eso mismo lo hacía. Y pues sí es feo que un padre se vaya y deje a su familia.
No nos pagaban por horas, nos pagaban nada más por el puro contrato.
Y a veces nos faltaban cajas de verdura, teníamos una cuenta y salían menos en la cuenta del checador. Pues a la semana son unos $70-80, ya al final de temporada pues era bastante. Creo que eran como 25,000 pesos mexicanos.
Sí, porque pues, nos habían hecho un papel pues de que nos iban a pagar nosotros por hora. Y ya resultando que ya empezamos a trabajar allá y todo, y pues no, la verdad no. Sí, pues era, cada viernes nos daban el papel. En la huerta pues ya hasta nos lo daban de lo que íbamos la cantidad que íbamos a regresar. No, pues ya hasta se sentía re feo regresarlo, porque pensaba uno que era todo para él, para uno pues, el dinero. Pero no, a veces nos tocaba regresar más de la mitad, el dinero.
Bueno, pues se supone que la empresa para la que trabaja este señor, supone que él está pagando conforme a la ley, legalmente, el salario mínimo se supone que es, entonces yo me imagino que el señor que nos tenía contratado, para no tener problemas como legales o no sé, pues él aparentaba que nos pagaba el salario mínimo y como nos lo depositaban al banco, él mismo nos llevaba en el autobús a cobrar el dinero al banco, y al salir del banco, pues ya supuestamente nos habían pagado legalmente, pero él nomás estiraba la mano al subir al autobús y decía, tú nada más hiciste tanto en la semana, te toca tanto, y la diferencia de lo que te cobraste en el banco, eso es para mí, me lo tienes que regresar. Y nos quitaba esa parte. Más del 50% de lo que ganábamos nosotros.
No, pues él nos amenazaba y nos decía que si no regresábamos el dinero, o sea, lo que tenían anotado en su libreta, pues que nos iba a mandar pues para México.
Pues desde que metimos la demanda, ya no aparecemos en la lista para ir para allá a trabajar con ellos.
Were there workers in the fields with you who were not contract workers?
En ese tiempo éramos puros contratados. Después, al final de temporadas, ya había muchos ilegales. En los últimos años ya hubo ilegales, pero anteriormente éramos puros contratados.
I'm very interested in the fact that the undocumented workers would come in at the end and they would be given the best fields. There's a benefit there to the employer, and I'm trying to understand what that benefit is.
El beneficio de ellos era que a ellos les pagaba más barato. Si era por horas, les pagaba $6.50 la hora. Y por contrato yo creo que igual que a nosotros, a 55 centavos la caja. Pero pienso que había más preferencia para ellos.
What you see is workers who incur enormous amounts of debt to get to the United States and are paying off those debts at very high interest rates to fairly scary loan shark types who are in their home countries where their spouses and children live, get to the United States who have the option of working only for one employer. And so if that employer turns out not to have a lot of work, or not to pay what's promised, or not to pay legal wages, the worker has very little recourse. The worker can't work anywhere else, and as a practical matter, he cannot go home because of the debt. And that is a recipe for abuse. There's just no doubt about it. That is a bad system.
Entonces estamos advirtiendo a toda la gente que cuando echan spray porque se muere el retoño del tabaco, ellos no pueden sprayar a 1 kilómetro por el mal olor del spray. Hubo files que andaban cortando el retoño y no se lava uno las manos bien, no te queda un aroma que en vez de comer llegas a vomitar. Hubo una vez, el patrón sprayó cerca de andábamos como 20 personas cortando el retoño. Yo les dije a ellos, y muchos les dije, ya bueno, porque yo tengo mucho tiempo de trabajo de tabaco, ya llega muy cerca. Andaba cerca de él, ya casi no le echaba. Y cerquita con un mexicano, también de los mojados. Se paró cerquita y dijo, no pasa nada, no sean miedosos, no. Pues huele bien feo, se siente uno mareado. Y ya otro día se pusieron mal los 3 muchachos. No pudieron trabajar más. ¿Qué pasó? No puedo, dijo. No puedo. Y dijo, y otro día, dije, ¿qué? Dijo, ya nos corrieron, que déjennos las camas porque van a venir otros. Entonces el siguiente día cortamos de vuelta, pero ya muchos nos sentían, yo me sentí mal. Fuimos al corte de vuelta a cortar tabaco y cortar retoño. Ese día me tocó a mí, a 2 nos tocó. Cortaba el retoño, pero yo sentía que no era yo. Yo me palanqueaba porque me daba el aire y me dijo, no, yo me llamo Gaetano, dice, señor, no calles, sálgase. Dije, yo quiero trabajar, yo tengo mi niño. Pues entré de vuelta al surco y cortar el retoño nomás no es difícil, es fácil, pero lo malo es que uno se siente bien mal. Agarraba la mata y me quedaba y me hincaba. Cortaba el retoño y me dijo, salte, está bien malo. Me salió un palo grande
Me acosté, a ver si me fueron a echar agua, y me echaron agua y me sentí, a ver cómo me sentí bien. Me escondieron para que me reforzara, a dos. Me reforcé, me levanté a trabajar de vuelta y me cortaron el tiempo, me dijo que me iban a cortar el tiempo. Un mayordomo cuando me iba a cortar el tiempo. Pues sí quedó. Al siguiente día, éramos los 17 y cayeron todos, nomás quedamos 5. Todos en una vuelta del surco, caían, se quedaban. Me morían todos, unos en los pinos, escarbaban la tierra para meterse con lo caliente de la tierra. De esos 5 nos dijo el mayordomo, no sirve, no valen para nada, lárguense para México. A nosotros nos llega más gente. Cortaba, me quedaba hincado. De que yo sentía que la tierra estaba temblando, yo sentía que me caía. Me dijo, párate, no puedo. Y para que ellos no me miraran, para que ellos no me corrieran, me hincaba.
Se va con tantas ilusiones de hacer algo aquí y pues no son unas cosas fáciles. Regresa uno, yo creo que peor, porque pues ya todo lo que vive uno desde que sale, dejar a la familia, todo. Y para nada.
Los niños siempre tienen ilusiones de que uno viene del norte, de papi, ¿qué me traes? No me traes nada. No, a veces no me podía ver niño, a veces me podía la droga que yo debía, de todo lo que beber a ellos, de que yo tengo mi familia en la escuela, de todo.
That's why we have said again and again that people who are calling for guest worker programs to be the model for immigration reform need to look at the programs we have. They need to look at what these programs look like in practice. Because what they look like in practice is perilously close to indentured servitude and human trafficking. I mean, that is the system that we have. We can move from having 125,000 people to having a few million people in that condition, but I don't think the condition would change.
It varies from country to country, the amount of the population that's indigenous. But for instance, Guatemala is heavily indigenous. Mexico, especially southern Mexico, is heavily indigenous. The unfortunate reality is the more indigenous you are, the less wealth you have, the less political power you have.
Usually they would be denied before they were ever even processed, beyond the consular level.
In the last maybe 15 years, probably coinciding more than anything with the passing of NAFTA, we have begun to receive rather large numbers of indigenous people from the southern parts of Mexico and from Central America. They come with very little money, which means that when they cross, they are paying the very cheapest guides, which means that there are more days walking in the desert. So they have very little sense of the geography. They'll land in Douglas, Arizona, for example, after crossing through Agua Prieta, and knock at the priest's door and say, can you tell me how to get to Florida? Thinking that it's a couple of days walk or not far.
Sufrimos mucho pues por ahí, ahí pues el desierto, ahí la migra pues está agarrando a gente y ahí tortillas de costada, lo que trae pues lo quitó ahí, lo agarró ahí la migra pues y no tienen de comer pues. Gracias a Dios que llegué bien ahí a mi pueblo y no trae nada.
You weapon will young and I've got to tell you something. Well, blessed are the meek, so get your guns off the street. And blessed are the poor, so don't hurt them anymore. With your manufactured dreams of men in suits and ties. And when it's said and done, you spit a stream of lies. Geronimo's daughter need not apply.
Indigenous peoples are being pushed off ancestral, communally held lands in Mexico, Central America, and South America. They are being pushed through other indigenous peoples' lands. Estimates are that of the 2,000 migrants who try to cross the border every day, 1,500 pass through the lands of the Tohono O'odham Nation. Most of the nation is in Pima County, Arizona. The Tohono O'odham Nation, ground zero for migrant deaths, ground zero for indigenous migrant deaths. The nation is undergoing an intertribal dispute over migrants. On one side are tribal leaders who say 1,500 migrants a day are causing severe environmental and religious damage to sacred land. They forbid placing water from migrants on the reservation. On the other side are members like Mike Wilson, who disobey the injunction.
When I encounter migrants, you see the face of the dispossessed. You see the face of the marginalized. You see the face of the unloved, of the unclean. You see the face of poverty. And you multiply that 2,000 times over. My battle is not against Tohono O'odham people. My battle is against the government of the Tohono O'odham Nation, which has the resources, has the manpower, and has casino profits to create its own water distribution program, the width and length of the Tohono O'odham Nation. When I was the lay pastor in Sells, my session was asking me very critically, Pastor, shouldn't you be teaching and modeling us how to obey all federal, state, and local civil laws? And why are you aiding and abetting criminal activity and criminals? Because by legal definition, they are all illegal. And my response to them was, as your pastor, if I must decide between a legalistic code and a universal moral code, which one must I obey? God's children are dying. Your brothers and sisters in Christ are dying. Men, women, children, infants, and pregnant women are dying in the desert. Which law must I follow? They don't want to acknowledge a moral question. They don't want to acknowledge a biblical mandate. That I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me water. Because if they acknowledge the moral question, they must acknowledge a moral responsibility. And they don't want to do that. It's easier to let them die.
Mr. Politician, you got to make a big decision and about the state of things. Well, one thing that we don't want here in the sand is just another Birmingham. There's another burning Birmingham.
Del cruzar a la vía del tren casi nos llevó un día. ¿Por qué? Porque es un pueblo y que entre el día te tienes que ocultar. En la noche tratar de que sea el tren. Y está la migración y hay perros.
Arizona, some people say, is the new Alabama. the epicenter of an intense struggle in which every day 2,000 people illegally try to cross a rigid demarcation line where thousands of other people try to stop them.
I remember that we were going through this long grass that poked and it was all over me and it was poking me. I was scared because I used to be afraid of the dark.
Alabamians continue to invoke the memory of the 4 little girls who died in the bombing of Birmingham's 16th Street Baptist Church in 1963. In Arizona, the new Alabama, at least 4 little girls have died because of inherently violent economic policies and a brutal militarized border.
Olivia Luna Noguera was an 11-year-old girl whose body was found on the territory, on the land of the Tohono O'odham Nation in southern Arizona in July 2006. When authorities found her, her body temperature was 106 degrees. She was wearing pink sneakers. She was traveling with her 16-year-old sister. They were trying to reach a suburb of Atlanta, Georgia, to join their parents who had been living there for a number of years. And what makes this death, for me at least, especially tragic was her youth, and also the way that many people responded to it. A number of people blamed the parents, asking what type of parents would force their child, right, force their children to cross such harsh terrain. Right? But I think that's the wrong question. I think the question we need to ask is what type of society forces parents to make that choice?
En el 92, cuando salí, me acuerdo que cruzábamos mi esposo y yo a pie por el hoyo, sin ningún problema para cruzar. Cruzamos como si nada, cruzamos parados, no tuvimos ni siquiera que agacharnos para poder cruzar la línea.
All migrants risk their lives and their families' property to cross borders illegally. With the increasing militarization of the border beginning in 1993, crossing has steadily become more dangerous, more expensive, and more humiliating.
How much did you pay your cliente?
$2,000.
Los del Salvador sí pagamos $6,000, $5,000.
$6,500 para venir a llegar hasta aquí en este país, y el dinero me costó bastante porque me estafaron. Y si no se los dábamos, nos iba él a regresarnos. ¿Y cómo nos íbamos a regresar si ya estábamos metidos en deudas? Que nuestra familia luchó. Mi suegra tuvo que dar los papeles de su casa para poder yo estar aquí, y vendí mi moto que tenía y vendí un terreno para poder llegar hasta aquí.
Cuando llegamos a México, después de cruzar 2 fronteras, El Salvador, Guatemala, Guatemala, México, llegamos a un lago. Ahí tuvimos que abordar 2 lanchas. Fue un momento difícil porque nos dividieron en grupos diferentes. Un grupo pasó, el otro no pasó debido a que la lancha volteó. Compañeros murieron. Luego tienes que abordar un tráiler donde nos meten a 130 personas por 28 horas. Desde Tabasco hasta Puebla.
Desde Guatemala vienen pagando dinero, vienen pagando cuotas para la Mara Salvatrucha.
para los guardias del tren. Si no pagan la cuota, los tiran del tren o los pueden asesinar. Venía una mujer de Centroamérica con su bebé en brazos en la parte de arriba del tren. La venció el cansancio, pero iba a la orilla del tren. Se quedó dormida y su bebé se le cayó del tren. Y cuando pudo bajarse, el bebé ya no lo encontró.
Cuando nos subimos al tren y nos escondimos en el baño, 5 personas amontonados, con un calor sofocante, con el ruido, eso es siempre, el ruido del motor siempre, porque estás dentro de la máquina. El pito, las paradas, ese pito que conocemos todos, lo escuchas fuerte. Y ahí viajamos, hicimos acerca como casi entre 10 horas, desde el río Texas a San Antonio.
Había veces que no había comida para darle a mi hija más grande porque no había trabajo. Y muchas veces comía una sola vez al día. Entonces ella tenía un dolor muy fuerte en su estómago, casi siempre. Y yo la llevaba con doctores y no la aliviaban porque no era necesidad de medicina, sino de buena alimentación. Entonces, al yo salir embarazada, mi segunda niña tenía casi 7 meses, cuando me dijeron que mi bebé, que quizás mi bebé iba a nacer de su cabeza muy grande y de su cuerpo muy pequeño. Y me dijo, no, hay muchas probabilidades de que tu bebé viva. Mi esposo y yo platicamos esa noche y decidimos irnos, cruzar a Estados Unidos.
Venía una señorita como de aproximadamente 18 años y los ladrones lo que hicieron, empezaron a violarla delante de nuestros ojos. Y la señorita nos empezó a gritar que la ayudáramos, Y nosotros nos íbamos a levantar a ayudarla, pero arriesgaban nuestra vida que nos mataran.
Decidimos aventarnos a la aventura. Nos vinimos a la orilla de la línea. Había unos carros aplastados. Había 3 carros que nos sirvieron como escalera para poder cruzar a Estados Unidos. En el brinco sí habían aparecido 2 chamaquitos que andaban ahí viendo a ver qué podían arrebatarle a las personas que brincaban el muro. Sí le quitaron a mi marido la mitad de lo que él llevaba. Él agarró a la niña en el brazo, la niña más grande, y con un brazo se resbaló hacia abajo. Estaba casi 4 metros o 5 metros de altura. Pues solamente me encomendé a Dios y brinqué también. Me acuerdo que acomodé mi estómago por un lado y hice esto. Agarré el tubo y me abracé de él. Como tardé tanto por estar embarazada, no pude hacer las cosas rápido, me agarraron.
Y que veníamos 20 y no cabían en ese carro, tuvieron que montar uno sobre otro, en una expedition, como 1 hora y media. Los niños que venían llorando porque no aguantaban.
Después nos llevaron al desierto, en medio del desierto, y nos dejaron ahí. Y después vino un carro y nos llevó así. Yo estaba enfrente en el carro, el del lado del copiloto y abajo. Y fueron como 10 horas de ahí para Phoenix. Y tenía yo mucho miedo porque tenía miedo de que si chocábamos ella se iba a romper el cuello porque estaba muy apretada con mi hermano.
Cuando veíamos el río Bravo que le llaman, como si que también las fuerzas y el ánimo se nos acabó porque el río era muy grande. Cuando pasamos nadando el río Grande, al otro lado, los coyotes que nos traían cruzando el río se llevaron nuestra ropa a un lugar seguro y nos hicieron caminar en puras espinas, caminando descalzos, sin zapatos, sin nada. Y dolían mucho las espinas, desnudos. Corrimos bastante porque cerquita de nosotros estaba migración.
The helicopters come really low and shine their lights, and they call it dusting.
and stir up all the dirt around the person to get them all scared and running, and especially if they're in a large group, people get lost from their group. That's the most dangerous thing, when they get lost from their group.
Algo que desconocen los migrantes al llegar al altar son las condiciones. Muchos de ellos no saben lo que es un desierto. Difícilmente lo sabemos nosotros que vivimos en él, ellos no lo saben. Por ejemplo, las temperaturas en invierno fácilmente caen por debajo de los 0 grados. Y en verano sobrepasan los 125 Fahrenheit a la sombra. Expuestos al sol se incrementa de 5 a 10 centígrados más. Las plantas en el desierto de Arizona en algunos lugares no crecen más de 1 metro, lo cual es casi imposible cubrirse del sol. Cuando corren se pierden muy fácilmente. Al perderse no saben a dónde caminar, y el único punto que tienen para orientarse es el sol. Muchos de ellos siguen al sol cuando se está ocultando. Si seguimos al sol cuando se está ocultando, nos estamos introduciendo más en el desierto, donde es casi imposible sobrevivir.
Dice ser coyote, dice saber las rutas, pero no se las sabe. Y están tonteando en el desierto, no saben realmente a dónde van. Por eso mucha gente se pierde y pues se desaparece en el desierto.
Violan a las señoritas y cuando vienen al camino que le vienen exigiendo, si no me vas a dar tal cosa yo te voy a matar, si no me vas a dar tal cosa te voy a dejar botada en el camino, si no me vas a dar eso te voy a dejar tirada, y por eso es que las señoritas por temor le dan lo que él les pide.
I was a little bit scared because in the desert there's lizards and snakes.
Al llevar como una hora aproximadamente, 1 hora y media de caminar, nos asaltaron. Yo iba siguiendo al coyote porque pues, yo no lo quería perder. Luego de... Es que con eso sí me pongo así como que... You know. Ok, luego de eso... pues el coyote llevaba a mi niño y lo bajó y lo llamaron nada más a él. Yo me fui caminando atrás de él pues porque no lo quería perder y me dijeron de que me regresara y nos pusieron a todos en una fila recta y una persona empezó a revisar las maletas de todos y otra persona nos estaba apuntando con una pistola y la otra persona estaba revisando a todos uno por uno. Luego de eso, pues en ese momento sí sentí mucho miedo porque pensé que nos iban a hacer algo y yo dije que, pues, que a la hora de que me fueran a llamar a mí, pues mis niños se podían poner a llorar y los podían golpear por lo mismo o les podían hacer algo peor. Me dijo que para qué la había traído, que ya no me había dicho que la trajera, que mejor la hubiera dejado con su abuelito.
Al migrante se le ha dicho que tenga mucho cuidado cuando vaya a cruzar el desierto, los peligros que pueda suceder. En el desierto la persona puede fallecer por falta de agua, por falta de comida.
Del peligroso es que se viene uno del camino y si traes comida pues está bien pasar y todos son montañas, cerro. Y si ahí se acaba la fuerza o lo que traes pues lo deja uno atrás y se muere uno y pues se queda uno atrás y ya no puede seguir adelante.
Fue una experiencia grata, bonita en el sentido de que cuando crucé la frontera, la temperatura estaba completamente fría. Era la medianoche. Parece raro que les diga que es bonito, ¿verdad? Pero todo eso me ayudó para cuando llegara aquí, porque cada día recordaba esa noche, cuando muchas personas no lograron cruzar.
Cruzar el desierto. Al cruzar el desierto, los mexicanos, antes de hacerlo, llenan una mochila con cosas, con ropa, con comida, con agua, con lo necesario para poder sobrevivir. Pero adentro de esa mochila también llevan todos sus sueños y todas sus esperanzas.
Yo lo necesitaba por sacar adelante a mi familia y por hacer mi casa, tener mis propias cosas. Y por tener mis propias cosas, por tener algo en la casa, tener mi propio techo y tener lo que... Tengo una familia con un hijo con 7 meses y quería sacarlo adelante.
You find all kinds of things out here. You find Bibles, you find little doilies and things they brought from home, letters. I found a bottle of cologne one time, and it was called Courage. You find little kid backpacks and little mirrors and little, tubes of lipstick or things that they left behind. We find birth certificates and driver's licenses, and things that look important, photographs, pictures of people with no names on the back, so we can't even return them to whoever they belong to.
Cuando ellos no pueden cruzar, cuando ellos abandonan la mochila en el desierto, muchos de ellos también abandonan sus sueños y sus esperanzas junto con todo.
So the fact that people are trying to come to the United States to access certain rights, right? And the fact that the border has to be increasingly militarized in order to deny them from realizing those rights is an example of how this, what we might call a violence of foundation, an original act of violence, translates into a violence of conservation.
The militarization of the U.S.-Mexico border began in conjunction with NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. According to the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service's 1994 Southwest Border Strategy, increased border militarization would be a deterrent to illegal migration. The strategy included making crossings so difficult and costly that fewer individuals would try. In other words, migrants would be pushed away from the relative safety of crossing through urban areas and into more and more remote areas. Limited numbers would die, word would get back to Mexican communities, and migrants would stop trying to cross. In part, the INS border strategy was based on its 1993 conclusion that throughout the following decade, illegal migration would increase as a result of the implementation of NAFTA.
So the very fact that we have people from Mexico and beyond now trying to come to what's today the southwest of the United States against the dictates of the US federal government has translated into this militarization apparatus that we've seen explode over the last 15 years. We now have 18,000 Border Patrol agents. It's scheduled to grow to 20,000 over the next year. Right? In effect, you have what a lot of people in the Southwest describe as an occupying army. Right? that is there to maintain the conquest, right? And what goes along with it, this denial of rights to anyone who would challenge that conquest by, for example, trying to cross the US-Mexico boundary without authorization to find work or to reunite him or herself with their families.
More migrants die crossing Arizona than anywhere else along the U.S. border. But prior to 1997, no one kept records of migrant deaths. Since 1997, about 5,000 migrant bodies have been recovered from the American Southwest. If this figure is accurate, it means that more people have died crossing the U.S.-Mexico border than died as a result of the September 11th terrorist attacks and Hurricane Katrina combined.
Well, the typical story that we get from those who are traveling with an individual who has died crossing the desert is not a very happy tale. Generally, it's an individual who progressively becomes more disoriented, confused, ill, meaning with nausea and vomiting, and eventually will just simply collapse. The death is not one where someone is just okay one minute and deceased the next. It seems to be a great deal of suffering involved.
The new border enforcement strategy that began in '94, their theory was that once the word got out about how hazardous that crossing would be, and particularly the increasing numbers of deaths of migrants, would be a deterrent to other people trying to cross. They were successful in sealing off the urban areas of the border, the traditional areas of migration. And they were right, people began to die. And they began to maintain statistics in '97. The number of deaths became significant enough for the United States government to begin to keep those statistics. The official numbers are somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 people. That's not an accurate statistic because people are dying in very remote, isolated areas of the desert.
Caminando como tres noches caminando y ahí pues lo vi un cuerpo, pues estaba muerto, pues cabeza, el brazo, costilla del muerto se murió ahí desierto. Y yo también pues le tengo miedo pues cuando me vi de eso.
That migrants that we talk to keep telling us of coming across bodies and coming across bones and coming across skeletons.
This is the second cooler that we built to accommodate the overflow of border crosser deaths that we have. Generally, these people can be here for months and sometimes even years as we attempt to identify them. And this cooler provides that long-term storage.
Estoy muy cansado y tengo mucha sed. Estoy adolorido con ampollas en mis pies. Ayúdame, Señor, que mi muerte se espere hasta después. Y yo siento que otra frontera estoy cruzando. Y en el otro lado la muerte me está esperando.
Una allá uno de allá no es mi pueblo, pero de Oaxaca pues se murió por decir que llegó bien allá de donde fue pues y me dijo el coyote, yo no sé a dónde se fue y no lo vi y que no sabe, pero ahí está testigo pues dice que se murió la muchacha, pero no hasta ahorita. Tiene como 28 años. Tiene con un niño nada más.
No puedo continuar, no puedo caminar, no quiero morir, no quiero morir, no quiero morir, no quiero morir, no quiero
This death toll and all of the suffering, that is a gross violation of human rights in everybody's estimate except the United States government's.
En la última década se han contabilizado más de 5,000 personas muertas y se está convirtiendo en el cementerio más grande de todo el mundo.
A couple of years ago, a migrant died almost in the back door of the Baptist church, in cells, and nobody said a word. You would think it was a stray dog that died.